For nearly 6 decades, the five families of organized crime had New York City in their grips. They were so powerful that they seemed untouchable. But by the 1980s, law enforcement had a new weapon at their disposal: wiretapping. And with it, they would pull back the curtain on these infamous crime groups. Today, let's look at how the FBI took down the five families. The Italian-American Mafia is often called the Five Families due to the fact that there are 5 main crime groups based in New York. These families are the Bonanno, Colombo, Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese-crime families. It all started way back in the early 1900s, when Italian immigrants came over to the United States and quickly found that life was tough. The only way to get ahead was to join a gang. That's when the five families were born. As time went on, each family became more powerful than the last. By the 1920s, the five families had become so powerful that they could control the entire city of New York. They did pretty much whatever they wanted. Bootlegging, extortion, murder, gambling, and prostitution were just some of the crimes that these families were involved in. By the 1930s, these 5 crime families were very well established. They controlled most of the racketeering, extortion, gambling, and narcotics trafficking in the United States. At this time, there was no effective law enforcement. In fact, many police officers were actually part of the Mafia, so if you got hit with a Mickey Mouse operation, chances are the cops wouldn't do anything about it. It wasn't until after World War II that the government started to crack down on the Mafia. However, by this time, the five families had already made so much money that they were able to hire some of the best lawyers in the country. So even though the government tried their best, they weren't able to take down the five families. It wasn't until the 1980s that things started to change. This was because the government had a new weapon at their disposal: wiretapping. Wiretapping allowed law enforcement to listen in on conversations that the mobsters had. And what they heard was shocking. They heard the mobsters talking about all sorts of illegal activities, from murders to drug deals. This gave law enforcement the evidence they needed to finally start taking down the five families. One of the first major successes came in 1985 when the FBI was able to convict John Gotti of racketeering. This was a huge deal because Gotti was the boss of the Gambino crime family, and he was considered to be untouchable. But thanks to wiretapping, the FBI was able to get the evidence they needed to convict him. From there, the FBI went after the other bosses of the five families. One by one, they were all convicted of various crimes. The FBI had finally done it. They had taken down the five families. You might be wondering, why didn't the Mafia just stop using phones? Well, that's not how the Mafia works. Phones were like the internet back then. People used them for business, personal matters, and everything else in between. They couldn't just stop using them because that would disrupt their everyday lives. Plus, they had already been using phones for years before wiretapping was invented, so they were used to using them. Wiretapping was a game changer for law enforcement. It allowed them to listen in on conversations that mobsters had, and they heard all sorts of illegal activities being discussed. This gave law enforcement the evidence they needed to finally start taking down the five families. One of the first major successes came in 1985, when the FBI was able to convict John Gotti of racketeering. This was a huge deal because Gotti was the boss of the Gambino crime family, and he was considered to be untouchable. But thanks to wiretapping, the FBI was able to get the evidence they needed to convict him. The thing about wiretapping is that it's extremely difficult to detect. In fact, even today, we don't know if our phone calls are being wiretapped. This is because wiretapping technology has come a long way since the days of the Mafia. These days, it's extremely easy to tap into someone's phone line or intercept their internet connection. With the right equipment, it can be done in seconds, without the person ever knowing. You might be wondering why the Mafia didn't just switch to using burner phones. Back in the day, burner phones were pretty easy to track. All the authorities had to do was follow the trail of where the phone was being used, and they would eventually track down the mobster. Also back then, people didn't use phones as much as they do today. They were more likely to meet up in person or use a payphone. Even if they did use a cell phone, it was probably hidden in a shoebox or something else out of sight. This made it easier for the FBI to detect and track their communications. John Gotti was the boss of the Gambino crime family, and he ruled it like a king. He had complete control over his soldiers, and they would do whatever he asked them to do. He was known for being flashy and generous. He loved to spend money on expensive clothes, cars, and jewelry. He also liked to throw huge parties that would make you think you were living in the 1920s. However, Gotti's reign of terror would eventually come to an end, thanks to the FBI. As the FBI started to wiretap his phones, they heard all sorts of illegal activities being discussed. This gave them the evidence they needed to finally arrest Gotti. On April 26, 1992, John Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without parole. This was a major blow to the Gambino crime family, and it sent a message to the other 4 families. The FBI was coming for them next. The next family that the FBI went after was the Genovese crime family. This family was headed by Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno. Like Gotti, the FBI had been wiretapping his phones, and they had enough evidence to charge him with racketeering. On March 12, 1986, Salerno was found guilty and sentenced to 100 years in prison. With 2 of the 5 family bosses behind bars, the FBI was starting to make some serious progress. Next, the FBI went after the lucchesefamily family. This family was headed by Anthony Corallo. Again, the FBI had been wiretapping his phones and they had enough evidence to charge him with racketeering. On April 24, 1987, Carlucci was convicted and sentenced to 70 years in prison. With 3 of the 5 family bosses behind bars, the FBI was really starting to make some headway. Now they went after the colombofamily family. This family was headed by Carmine Persico. Again, the FBI had been wiretapping his phones, and they had enough evidence to charge him with racketeering. On October 26, 1987, Persico was convicted and sentenced to 100 years in prison. With 4 of the 5 family bosses behind bars, the FBI was almost done. Only one family was left, the bonannofamily family. This family was headed by Philip "Rusty" Rustelli. Once again, the FBI had been wiretapping his phones, and they had enough evidence to charge him with racketeering. On December 18, 1987, Rustelli was convicted and sentenced to 50 years in prison. There was only one problem. While all this was going on, the 5 families weren't sitting around twiddling their thumbs. They had launched a massive war against the government, had been bombing the homes and offices of the prosecutors and FBI agents who were working on their cases. They had also been killing any witnesses who could testify against them. The government was in a tough spot. They didn't want to give up now. At the same time, they had to protect the people who had given them the evidence that had taken down the 5 families. In the end, the government decided to take a page out of the Mafia's playbook. They went after the family's associates and made deals with some of the turncoats. This information was used to further dismantle the 5 families. The 5 families were officially done. Over the years, many of the mobsters who were arrested and convicted have been released from prison. But that doesn't mean that they're done. The Mafia is still around today, but it's nothing like it was in the past. The 5 families are just a shell of their former selves. They're not nearly as powerful or wealthy as they once were, but they're still dangerous. In recent years, the Mafia has gotten back into the gambling and loan sharking businesses. They're also still involved in a lot of white-collar crime. But their days of running the streets of New York are over. It may seem like the FBI won in the end, but that's not really true. Sure, they took down the 5 families and put their bosses in prison, but they never really stopped the Mafia. The 5 families may be gone, but the Mafia is still around today. If you enjoyed this video, then check out another one of my videos on the secret weapon that took down Al Capone. Until then, I'll see you guys on the next one.